G'day everyone, thanks for coming. So I'm talking about wild pollination services in the southeast of South Australia. This is a Goyder funded project, and it's part of this overall project looking at carbon offsets research to support the state carbon sequestration strategy. It's quite directly related to, I'll mention the funding bodies and the supporters of the project, which is great. The project's quite closely related to Courtney's talk previously. He mentioned that they were looking at co-benefits around carbon sequestration and how to promote carbon sequestration. So obviously the state wants to be carbon neutral by 2050, and the combination of emissions reduction and carbon offsets abatement. But the emissions reductions fund, as Courtney covered, doesn't really cover the cost of planting carbon and the opportunity costs from agriculture. So we're looking at these co-benefits, and the project overall is looking at several co-benefits: pollination, shelter belts and water quality at this stage, and I'm just going to be talking about pollination. So really the big question is, can pollination services from wild bee populations improve the economics of carbon sequestration? The benefits from wild pollination are economic. Can we replace getting hives in, paying an apiarist to bring in bees to pollinate our crops? And there's also further questions about pollination or food security. So if crops are, or if bee populations are subject to mortality, sudden hive mortality, or some of the viruses that are prevalent around the world at the moment, there could be an impact there as well. The common crops that are pollinator dependent that we're interested in are lucerne seed, which is a significant crop in South Australia, and also apples. There are obviously more, but I'm just going to focus on lucerne seed today. The study site is in the southeast of South Australia, but nearly 90% of the country's lucerne seed is grown in this area between Tintinara and Keith. So this is the study site here. This tile, I guess, of land just to the east of Tintinara. It's about 15 kilometres by 14 kilometres. Dominant land uses are pasture, grazing and also growing hay, but cropping, and it's mixed irrigated and dry land, and obviously there's quite a lot of lucerne seed grown, and also lucerne hay grown. And the lucerne's grown dry land as well as irrigated, and it has different impacts for the pollination. We're going to focus on dry land though today. So we're modelling pollination services. We chose the Invest Natural Capital Project model. This it's integrated valuation of ecosystem services and trade-offs. This is actually quite a large suite of models that look at all sorts of ecosystem services, but within that there's a crop pollination model. It's an index-based model. It estimates, its actual role is to estimate pollinator abundance and how changes in land use and land use properties affect pollinator abundance. Its main inputs are nest sites for different species of bee or pollinators, the floral resources available to them both in the crop that you're interested in and also outside of that, and then the flight ranges of the different species. It also creates an index of the value of the pollinators to agricultural production, so essentially yield, and I'll talk briefly about that as well. So the inputs, it takes a land use or land cover input, which is a rastered data set, and we've used the Australian Land Use and Management Classification, or ALAM land use, pretty common. And so that data set breaks the landscape up into different classes of land use, things like cropping, pasture, different types of pasture, that sort of thing. And we need to parameterise that for different habitat and floral resources for the species that we're interested in. So these are the nesting index, and you can see in this table here, for example, we've got a cavity nest index. So we're, for example, attributing, it's an index-based system, so all these values are between 0 and 1. We're saying in this example that strict nature reserves have a very high nest cavity index, so there's a lot of hollows for species that like hollows, and less amount of ground nesting and you can see those 4 examples there have different rates of all of these things, or different indexes of all of these things. And also the floral, we have to attribute a floral resource, so how much foraging capacity is there for different species, or for the species. We also have to parameterise for the bee species or the guilds that we're interested in. We've focused on 3 because this is obviously quite a broad scale study. Honeybees are the most prevalent in the landscape. Obviously European honeybees are introduced, but there's also we're using the banded bee and the halictine species as representatives of native species. These have different nesting preferences, so European honeybees like to cavity nest and the others prefer ground nesting. The model also allows for spring and summer foraging or prevalence, and although I'm not going to talk about it here, I have looked at other species besides lucerne, including canola, which is a spring flowering species, and lucerne, which is a summer flowering species. You also, the big differences between these species, obviously the distance that they can travel, so European honeybees can travel several kilometres, whereas the native species much less than that. And the relative abundance in the landscape is very different. There's 2 orders of magnitude between the introduced species, much more prevalent than the native species. And then we also have to define the farm that we're interested in. So what we're really trying to work out is how will the number of bees change on the crops that we're trying to grow based on how we manage the landscape around them, largely through planting carbon. So I'm going to talk through some of the scenarios I looked at. These are really just examples of a much broader suite, but I think they'll tell the story. So this is, again, this tile here is the study area, just to the east of Tintinara, and this red dot here is our farm. So in this example, we're just looking at a single paddock. It's pretty common kind of paddock size. It's about 40 hectares in the southeast. It looks a lot like a centre pivot paddock, but it doesn't have to be. It could be anything really. And then these strips in the middle are just basically clips out of that larger tile showing different revegetation rates around the paddock. So we've got down the bottom here is the 2% revegetation, 2 hectare revegetation rate, and up the top is 80 hectares. So that's double the size of the paddock itself. Looking at the graphs, if you look at the graph at the top, you can see this is the percentage change, showing the percentage change from the baseline being no revegetation at all, in bee or pollinator abundance in that paddock. So you can see there's, in terms of percentage change, there's quite a significant increase. We get above a 50% rise from the baseline, which is really quite promising. And we also get a commensurate increase in yield, which is again really quite promising. However, if you look at the index value, which is the output from the model itself, so this index is, we're expecting a value between 0 and 1. So 1 is as many bees as you could get in the landscape. They're incredibly low. So we're getting a 50% increase on something that's very, very low, 0.02 to about 0.03 for the abundance. So what that's saying is that there's, at this local scale, introducing a large amount of vegetation at a very local scale, at a farm scale, is not having a significant impact on the number of bees or the number of pollinators available in that paddock. Another way to look at this, and another one of the scenarios we looked at, was the landscape change. So I talked earlier about attributing different index values to the landscape classifications for this area of land. The largest land use in this map is lucerne pasture and mixed grasses. That's the green colour in the background. And the values that you've seen so far are based on an index value for a landscape that looks very much like this top picture here, which is a relatively denuded landscape. So it doesn't provide a lot of cavity nests or trees for bees, and it is assumed to be largely used for grazing, which has which is very bad for ground nesting species. The soil compaction tends to destroy their nests. But we looked at 3 scenarios of different landscapes or different qualities of that landscape. So a very poor landscape, which is this low habitat here at the bottom, and then a moderate and a high. So increasing the number of nesting sites available, and which is largely a measure of the number of large trees and the diversity of trees in the paddocks. So what this is showing is, so here we still have increasing native vegetation or revegetation across the bottom, and we have this index value. And so you can see that the low quality habitat is an order of magnitude lower than the high quality habitat. And what that's saying is that one of the solutions here is to look at that landscape change, and a small amount of improved habitat over a larger area, similar to the suggested ways of promoting other types of biodiversity in the landscape, particularly birds. So it really does hold with other ecosystem philosophies. And that is all. Thanks very much.